Welcome to the Book Hook podcast, where I've got cool insider book info, author and industry expert interviews, book reviews, and much more. Today, I'm chatting with Canadian author Catherine Bush about her latest book and debut collection of short stories, Skin, what it's like writing in community, and maybe some zombie plants and fungi protagonists.
I'm Catherine Bush, author of Skin, novelist, and a later career turned short story writer.
Yes, thank you for being here, Catherine. I feel like you missed out on a few details there, like shortlisted for Books in Canada First Novel Award, City of Toronto Book Award, the highly acclaimed The Rules of Engagement was a national bestseller and chosen as a New York Times notable book and a best book of the year by none other than the Los Angeles Times and the Globe and Mail.
Yep, all true.
Yeah, all true. All of
That's
the
it.
above.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going to come back to that because I want to know the feelings you had when you found out all of the above.
But this is my first story collection, which is exciting in its own way.
Let's get into Skin. I definitely want to start there. I just finished reading it last week. First of all, let's start with the title itself, Skin. It's direct, it's provocative. Why Skin?
Well, because it's direct and provocative. I love one-word titles. I love short titles that are easy to remember and also just open up suggestively, thematically. And when my editor, Andre and Alexis, and I were putting together this collection, thinking of it as a collection, thinking about how to order the stories, we were also thinking about it thematically. And certainly it's a collection about intimacies, unusual intimacies between humans and the more than human world. And Skin is so, it's so physical. It, it surrounds us. It is us. It's our porous boundary and connector to the world and other people. And I think the collection is in its way obsessed with touch, what you can touch and what you can't touch. And so Skin seemed to summon all of that. And it's the title of one of the stories in the collection.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, what is your interest or fascination with this intimacy and with, the visceralness of skin and touch, and as you say, the porousness that we have with each other?
I'm interested in intimacies that don't take us in a conventional direction.
Mhm.
So in the title story, Skin, which is a very short story, it's about a woman, the narrator's mother, who becomes obsessed with foot washing, goes off to Tanzania to wash people's feet, comes back, washes the feet of refugees newly arrived in the country, and ends up at her ex-husband's deathbed, and talks to the narrator about her own strange erotic relationship with her feet. And so I'm always interested in going in these unexpected doors to think about how we connect with other people and disrupting readers' expectations, both about where a story might go and where intimacy might take us and where we might find it. And in the first story in the collection, Benevolence, which is it's a novella really, about a youngish Canadian woman living in New York, a performance artist working as a substitute teacher, who invites one of her students to come and live in the spare room of her apartment, with unintended consequences. But again, I want to play with readers' expectations about where they think that relationship might go, and confound them in a way, while using that fraughtness, that erotic tension, to see where that might lead.
There was something when I was reading that one in particular, and there was another story, Camouflage. It felt very tantalizing to me, almost as if, and this, I don't know if this says something about me, I wanted to see the characters go there, but I also did not. And what you did was push that eroticism, that closeness, right to the edge. But then there's this sort of denial, there's this holdback. How were you able to balance that tension while still keeping it universal and intimate at the same time, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that was one of the challenges of both the pieces. And benevolence is a little hard to talk about without revealing things that I would
Mm,
rather the reader discovers as they read. But I did want to push the reader into a place where they were, in a sense, wanting something to happen that ethically they probably shouldn't want.
mhm,
And so for the reader to be forced to confront that in themselves, even as the characters are dealing with this problematic intimacy. In Camouflage, it was very hard to navigate tonally
mhm,
because it is a story full of erotic longing and someone, Danny, the narrator, whose impulse always is to escape, to run
mhm,
away, and who pushes himself into a situation where he can no longer do that. And that was again what I wanted to work with, someone whose impulse is to be flirtatious, get this close, and
mhm,
then vanish. And what happens when he finally can't vanish anymore, but
mhm,
has to be as he is. He's naked at the end of the story, confronting this other man, Ethan, and
mhm.
has to be wholly in his own skin.
It felt like as I was reading it, I was being pushed to a boundary as the observer, as somebody who witnesses two people going to the edge there, and you're just not sure what is happening. And I found that throughout the entire collection, there was that I was being confronted with some of my own, I don't know if it's hang up of intimacies, but questioning what could be intimate and what might not be intimate. You said on an interview, I think it was with Brian Crombie, and I wrote it down because I thought it was fascinating. As a writer, you want to get people imaginatively into their own bodies. What does that mean?
I guess I want people to enter their own bodies through the bodies of my characters.
Mhm,
You know, I think my desire is to create a world that is sensual and material and embodied. And interestingly, I think I start from a place that is quite visual and in a
mhm,
sense, you know, in a way removed. I see things, and that's how I'm very visual in terms of how I take in the world. And then it's a journey myself to feel really embodied, fully
mhm,
embodied in the world. But it's what I desire. So I bring that desire into my writing, into the
mhm,
worlds that I create on the page. And I think it's never more important than now when we live these screen lives to really be able to enter and feel with and touch and listen and just be fully sensual in our bodies. And I do believe that the art of fiction is one way to get us there.
Do you think we've lost some of that closeness, that connection, and giving ourselves permission to connect with each other over the maybe with social media or maybe during the pandemic?
I feel that at the same time, when we're able to be close and connect and stay in touch in ways that weren't possible. I mean,
Mhm,
screens were a savior during the pandemic. And I will say that this collection, a lot of it was written during the pandemic. And someone else that I was in conversation with was saying, you know, this is a collection that's obsessed with touch and skin, written in a time where we couldn't touch each other. And I do think that there was unconsciously an obsession that was coming through because of the times in which it was written. I'll never forget when I saw my friend, the writer Sham Salvador, in person for the first time after, you know, many months. And
mhm,
we were on Roncesvalles Avenue and we asked each other for permission to hug each other, which we never ordinarily do.
mhm,
And that hug is imprinted in me forever
mhm,
because it was, you know, it was so full of import and
yeah,
necessary, you know, sensuality and intimacy. So I think some of that repressed energy
mhm.
from the pandemic probably came out in the collection, even though these are ongoing obsessions for me as a writer.
I wonder if it's even, when you were talking about that hug, I was actually remembering two hugs that I've had that live in my memory. They were so good, and I told the hug givers how amazing those hugs were, and they lasted a long time, and they were squishy, and I'm wondering if, and I felt this way when I was reading Skin. Why do I feel strange wanting to read these characters go right to the edge and even over the edge of this intimacy, give in to these desires, whatever the desire might be? I'm wondering if that intimacy or the admission that we need that intimacy over the past 5 years or so is something is lost there, and perhaps there's a vulnerability and that you also might be looking at in your own writing.
Yeah. Though your question also, your comment takes me in a different direction because, with benevolence or
Mhm.
camouflage, in a way you want the characters to have sex, basically. You want
Yeah.
them to get that close. And there's a transgression in that,
Mhm.
but part of me approaches that as an expected transgression.
Mhm.
And so I want to go somewhere else. I want to show that there are other routes, other possibilities, because it's the unexpected that interests me,
Mhm.
the unpredictable as a writer. So that's where I want to go. That's where I want to look for the intimacy. So that was it. Interestingly, both those stories originated a long time ago. I pulled out during the pandemic drafts of these stories that I'd written, maybe Benevolence, as long ago as the late 80s.
Oh,
Came out of the
wow.
time of my life that I spent in the East Village of New
Mhm.
York. And Camouflage too is its seed is based on a,
Mhm.
a story someone I worked with told me in those days. And I drafted them, never published them. They never really got finished. And I came back to them as a mature writer and
Mhm.
totally reimagined them. And the impulse that was driving me at this point was not so much to go to the expectedly transgressive place, but
Mhm.
where's the other place that can use that energy, but swerve it somehow.
Mhm.
And it's the swerve and what that forces us to confront, both
Mhm.
me as a writer and you as a reader. That
Yeah.
interests me.
That actually brings me perfectly to two of the stories, which I think are going to be stuck in my head for, in perpetuity. The first one being Derecho. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah,
Derecho?
yeah.
Yeah. And this a man falling in love with the wind, and there's an eroticism there, as well as the story that comes right after, Glacial, which really, when I read it, I felt like I was holding my breath because there was so much tension there, and I thought, what is real and what is not real? Where did Derecho come from for you, this story?
I wanted to write a story about a man who fell in love with the wind.
Why? I need to know why.
That may be a mystery to me. I will say that I have become obsessed with extreme wind events. And
Okay.
where I live in the West End in Toronto, we get these really extreme weather front shifts
Mhm.
that come through 5 minutes and trees are falling down. And
Yeah.
and that I live part-time in the country, and that's happened there too. Trees come crashing down. My shed has gone tearing across the yard, and these aren't
Mhm.
even tornadoes. And I also was thinking in larger terms about climate grief and, upset about the state of the world. And I wanted again to turn my energy somewhere else
Mhm.
and think about love in this
Mhm.
context, and love for the more than human world, and what it would be like to create a character whose response wasn't just horror or
Mhm.
grief, though he feels grief and some horror and anger and a whole mixture of things. Hugh, the narrator of the protagonist of Derecho, is an Arctic biologist who studies polar bears and their
Mhm.
habitats, and gives this up after something deeply traumatic occurs to him, and turns his attention to pursuing a series of wind events that are based on actual wind events that happened in
Mhm.
21, 22. I rearranged them a bit, but I took actual phenomena, and he's asking himself in a way, how do I live now? But how do I
Mhm.
do that with attention and tenderness and what's called up out of me. And also I just like the erotic idea of a guy basically having an affair with the wind. I mean, his wife asked him at some point, like, are
Are
you
you
having an
having
affair? An
well,
affair?
kind of,
Yeah,
yes.
he kind of is. And so, the idea of spinning the affair, I do that a little bit in this other story, International Headache Conference, where these two
Mhm.
characters who have extreme headaches, boy, would I like to go to an international headache conference. Anyway, they show up. They have this kind of meet cute in
Yeah.
the face of their incredible pain, which is getting worse. And they end up having this strange tryst in a hotel where, again, you might expect the story to go to sex, but it goes somewhere else. And it's the somewhere else that interests me. And so with Hugh and this affair, it's like, what is it like to have an affair with the
The
wind?
wind.
What does that feel like? And so I've been in some pretty extreme wind experiences. Not I was watching YouTube videos of, I think it's Hurricane Ian that went
Mm,
through West Florida in 2022, 21 or 22. Never been in something that extreme, but
yeah.
it's the world we live in now. But to turn that towards how do we pay attention, and how do we do so intimately, and how do we do that in relation to the non-human world? So with Glacial, this woman who, like me, went on an expedition to the Arctic on a sailing, an old sailing ship with a group of artists, like me, ends up holed up in a shack in an isolated patch of ground and locked in there from the outside because it was the only way that was possible because of the risk of polar bears, and the residency couldn't spare a guard just to stand outside. And I went on this expedition interested in how do we find intimacy with melting glaciers. And
Mhm.
one of the things I discovered was how each glacier in its melting is so distinct. They each have their own voice. Some are very loud and
Mhm.
cracking and crashing, and others are much quieter. And I just began to think about what happens when we pay really particular attention to a glacier, and don't think of it in this alien, monstrous, huge, menacing, or all the ways that people might think about glaciers
Mhm.
in that way, but approach it through the lens of intimacy. And then in the story, something happens, which alas did not happen to me.
Thank goodness for that, but I think it was also the ending that made me go, "Wait, what is real and what is not real
Well,
right
that's
now?"
good. That's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually had a conversation with a friend, Amanda Leduc, yesterday about it, and we both came up with completely different, understandings
Oh,
of the
really?
story.
Oh,
Yeah. I thought you
well,
might like that.
that is so good. I mean, I will say that the character does something else that I didn't do, which is, she downs some hot sauce.
Yeah.
She finds some hot sauce in this cabin, and who knows what good is going to happen to you when you start downing Texas hot sauce in
No.
a remote cabin on Svalbard in the high Arctic.
I feel like even just being in the high Arctic, in a remote cabin, you don't need the Texas hot sauce to start hearing and seeing other things that possibly could be there, but you're not entirely sure as the reader what is
Yeah.
there and what isn't. But I think that's beautiful. I think coming closer to the end of the collection, I'm seeing far more climate. There's a lot more climate fiction in the collection, which I know was Blaze Island for you as well, which was your last novel, came out in 2020. First of all, what is climate fiction?
Any fiction that is somewhat realistic these days in terms of portraying our world as it is, I would say there are strands of it that are speculative, strands that may be dystopic, but my approach in Blaze Island was very different, where I really wanted to write in a more head-on way. Wrote about a climate scientist and his daughter living on this remote island, and his
Mhm.
interest in possible geoengineering experiments that are ethically problematic in all sorts of ways, while
Mhm.
creating this kind of paradise of nature for his
Mhm.
daughter that may not be able to be sustained. Whereas with this collection with Skin, again, it's this question of intimacy that's
Mhm.
driving me, and really to find a lens that wasn't grief
Mhm.
driven, but was driven by attentiveness and love. Like, what does love and love for the world beyond the human look like at this moment in time? And that was the impulse with these stories. Because I really think, in a larger sense, that it's important we bring that energy to the
Mhm.
world, not just, I have very little patience for dystopic stories. I just think narratively it's a dead end as well as a kind of life dead end. We need
Mhm.
to approach the world, with tenderness, with attentiveness. We need to really pay attention to what's there before we can think about how to save it, if that's what we want to do. I don't see that as the writer's task. I see
Mhm.
the writer's task as paying attention as deeply in as we can, in whatever way we feel called to respond to this world that we're in all its fragility and
Mhm.
complexity. And for me at this time, that involves bringing the more than human world to the page. I feel that as a necessity to create a fictional world that feels fully alive to me.
And alive with, like, you've given this possibility of love and tenderness and hopefulness to the reader in the climate fiction that I've read in Skin, because I've always seen climate fiction as something dystopic, something like here's the worst case scenario. And I think a lot of people do probably think that way too. I mean, look at films, TV, a lot of zombie plants.
I mean, there's
Everyone's
a place for zombies and zombie plants. I get it, and zombie fungi. Um, but if you flip thinking about
yeah.
fungi from the zombies to all the ways that we depend on them to survive, and their fantastic networking, web making possibilities, which offer us as writers structural and metaphoric possibilities too, as well as why not put a bunch of fungi in a story, which I
Yeah.
didn't do this time, but hey, maybe I will at some point.
So we met officially in our the creative writing, the MFA creative writing program, where I'm a student. Catherine, lovely, amazing Catherine here, was my instructor in my novel class, and in the plenary class, which was taught by Kinesia Lebrun, she had said in one of Kinesia's epic genius rambles, had said, wouldn't it be cool to have an entire story written from the perspective of moss, just moss?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I teach in the undergrad program at well, and I as well at the University of Guelph, and I teach a course called speculative fiction, and I teach another course called writing nature. And in the speculative fiction course, I spent some energy trying to invite my students to inhabit perspectives beyond the human, and just as an act of imagination, it's important for us to do that. It's not about getting it right. We should approach it with humility,
Mhm.
and responsibility, but also desire. And some amazing things happened. This beautiful story by a trans student talking about becoming a tree and using it
Oh,
metaphorically, but it was wonderful. It got published, actually, I think in Room magazine,
wow.
and another story that we did a little section about imagining our way into Antarctica. And one of the students wrote a story from the perspective of bacteria waking up in the warming Antarctic ice. And these were, my invitation
Oh,
was broad. So these were places the students got to on their own, but they were wonderful, wonderful.
what does that feel like as an instructor, a professor, a mentor to, new writers? What does that feel like when you experience something like that?
I think it's one of the reasons that I teach, to offer up possibilities of re-seeing and re-entering the
Mhm.
world, not telling students what to do or how to do it, but just offering them invitations, both through the stories we've read, Octavia Butler, Ursula Le
Mhm.
Guin, etc. But yeah, just opening doors for them to go through, and just to expand their sense of the world is and what the art of speculation might be as writers.
And it's better to understand, well, to get to an understanding of the world that is actually not told to us, that we discover it on our own, both as the writers and as the readers, which is it's a fascinating journey, and one that, in my mid 40s, I'm only now discovering in my own program and meeting people like you. There are other ways of doing this. Climate fiction does not have to be doom and gloom. News to me.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So yeah, and I will say that Skin also includes a story, a retelling of Cyrano de Bergerac, which is a
Yes.
19th century play set in 17th century France that I remake as a 21st century story set in 17th
Hmm.
century France, told from the perspective of the woman in that triangle, because I really thought she needed a voice.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of fun with that. And again, it's a story about people who don't touch.
Hmm.
They can't really touch. And how is intimacy created between them? I swerve and reverse the expected story there too.
And you did in the very last story as well, which I thought it was well placed right after Glacial. In the park, the great horned owl summons his mate, and it is told from the perspective of the great horned owl. And it is what, 200 words, 250 words. It is so short. I would not have expected a short story this short to be told from the perspective of a great horned owl. Where did that come from?
Two places, I would say, and I'm so glad you responded strongly to that story. Andre, Alexis, my editor, says it makes him cry every time he reads it, which just moves me right through my heart. I spent a lot of time at High Park. I live very close to High Park, and I have two dogs, and I'm there every day. And there are a pair of great horned owls that live in the park, and the male indeed lost his mate, and that meant that he was crying day and night in a way. They often hoot at dusk, but his cries were going on much longer through the day and through the night, more plaintive and filled with, I don't know, owl longing. But I was, again, during the pandemic, taking an online course through this wonderful British collective called Dark Mountain, which is committed to the project of how do we respond through writing, through fiction, to this ecologically fragile, unraveling moment. And they did a series of workshops taking us through the seasonal year and the old Celtic festivals. And one of them was called Kinship with Beasts. And so we were invited to write from the perspective of a more than human creature. And so I went to my owl, who I had heard calling in the park, and just went to his voice. I can't be an owl. And what I'm trying to do is create a bridge between me and owlness and discover an intimacy that way. I'm not trying to create accuracy, but summon the owl somehow through me. And that's what my words, my language can do.
So, how did you come to writing stories like this in both novels and in short stories, dealing with the closeness, these intimacies, climate change, our relationship with the world around us and as caretakers of this world? How did you come to that in your writing journey?
I think it's something that I've always been interested in. I think that I'm someone who's always felt that the world beyond the human is alive. It's just a given. That's never been negotiable for me. And when I encounter people for whom that's not the case, it's odd and can be just
Yeah.
baffling or certainly.
Yeah.
And in my first novel, published way back in 1993, Minus Time, it's about an astronaut mother circling the planet and the space station, narrated by her daughter, Helen, who's back on Earth in Toronto, living in this Roncesvalles neighborhood. And she gets involved with a gang of animal rights activists who, in the course of the novel, become more nonviolent environmental protesters. And so that energy has somehow always been in my fiction. I think in the novels between Minus Time and Blaze Island, I was more focused on dilemmas between people, dilemmas that had both a private, often erotic component and a public facing side. In the rules of engagement, my narrator, Arcadia Hearn, has had a pistol duel fought over her as a college student in a Toronto ravine and gets involved in writing about issues of military intervention in the 90s and trying to figure out her way through that while grappling with this weird private past. And she's forced to do so,
Mhm.
and the two strands of the novel come together as she's compelled to help a refugee named Basra who's trying to escape across borders.
Wondering when writing started for you.
I've always written from the time I was young. As a child, I think I was very quiet when I was young. I was very shy, and I'm not someone even now for whom words come easily. So writing is always an active translation from the nonverbal world. And yet I've always had that impulse to do that, partly because it's very difficult. It's been both a need and a desire to turn the world into story and make meaning that way, coming from a family where things were not spoken of. Again, the impulse to try and speak them, and in my case, write them, felt very strong. So I wrote through high school, college, and wrote some short stories then, but really felt the impulse to write a first novel, which I did. And then I kept going, novel after novel.
You did with aplomb, kind of burst onto the scene. So you've been writing for a long time. And things have changed since you first started writing politically, socially, economically. And you are also an instructor and mentor now to young writers. What is it like now being an artist? What are the struggles? What are the barriers? And what are the hopes of being an artist today?
When I started, it was still a world in which the literary world was full of print media. You know, there were big standalone book sections. The Globe and Mail here in Canada had a standalone book section. You know,
Yeah.
you could expect a degree of review coverage that is pretty much impossible to get in the same way today. And then things have moved online. And also because I'm not a fast writer, I publish a book every 5 to 8 years. Each time I publish into a very different literary ecosystem. Again, in the 90s, there was a lot more money in advances for writers, and I was lucky enough to be able to take advantage of that then. So, you know, there have been economic shifts too. Now there's much more of a online community, which is, you know, I have to say with Skin, I've been really impressed and pleased just to see it embraced by younger readers and to see, you know, a number of new literary publications like the Seaboard Review becoming so active on the Canadian literary scene. So I take heart that there is a continued energy and there's a continued commitment to community, I think. And that is really confirming. And it's interesting to move through time and look at generations of younger writers. And one of the joys, certainly, of being involved as coordinator of the MFA for 14 years and now teaching is the opportunities that it offers to not only mentor, but learn from and communicate with and build community with younger writers. It's such a gift. And I do feel that there's still enormous energy and commitment to this project of making meaning through narrative. I mean, you're writing fiction, but you've also wonderfully written nonfiction, and that can be as generative as important and a different way of approaching narrative. So, you know, one could feel hopeless in some ways, but I actually take great heart in what I've experienced and what I've experienced with Skin. And I think we constantly have to be looking for new ways to create literary community. And when I'm teaching too, I'm always saying to students, we've got to be readers, not just writers. We write into a community of readers, and we have to be part of that reciprocal energy as reader, as writer, that feels so essential that we
Mhm.
have to enter community in both ways. I mean, there's so many books that are, and so many Canadian, like amazing Canadian books that are published every season. I hardly know where to start
Well,
to
we could
name them.
start with Goose Lane
Yeah, which is
for
published Skin.
there's a
um,
start.
yeah,
Hi,
yeah.
Goose Lane.
And they publish wonderful books, Coach House, Freehand, and Nancy, and Woolsack and Wynne, and
Mhm.
and so I just think it's important to embrace the community of writing that exists in this troubled but
Mhm.
still wonderful place that we call home, and with all of its varied communities.
And you are one of the beacons in the community for a lot of us who are still trying to find our way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.